Well, good afternoon, everybody, and a very warm welcome to the Practical Steps for Farms Transitioning to Net Zero webinar. So the format for this webinar is expected to last for about an hour and will be split into two halves, with the first session being a series of short presentations from our panelists. And then the second session will take the form of answering your questions. We've already received some questions, thank you very much, but we will be inviting questions from the live audience throughout the presentations. And to do that, to ask a question, you just need to pop your question in the box at the bottom of your screen. The webinar will be available on catch-up, as will the slides and the resource pack, and you will receive an email when those become available. So in a moment, I'll introduce our panelists, but before I do, I just wanted to introduce myself and also to cover the objectives of the webinar. So good afternoon, I'm Anna Clifford. I'm a senior sustainability consultant for Promar. I started my career in the infrastructure and development sector, but in 2018 joined Promar, and I work with customers in the livestock, dairy and utility sector, with a particular interest in ecosystem services and sustainable land management. Now, getting on to the content of the webinar, the subject of climate change and net zero is obviously very complex. We're not going to cover it all in an hour, but the focus for today is very much about how we can share some easy wins, how we can signpost you to support, specifically around 4 key areas. And those areas are, firstly, what are the 3 easy steps I can take away and act on today? Secondly, how easy is it to improve my sustainability credentials and also my bottom line? And then thirdly, are there any activities which could result in a bigger impact than others? Finally, we'll be looking at whether or not, whether there's any guidance available for your subsector and how that can help you transition to net zero. So without further ado, I'll introduce my panelists. Today I have colleagues from Promar. Luke Briggs is a sustainability specialist and provides technical guidance and support on sustainability strategy, working across a wide range of sectors on various different sustainability programs for Arla, Wyke Farms and Omsco, Glanbia, to name just a few. Luke completed his MSc in agroecology, which has really sparked his passion in healthy, sustainable soils, and soil sequestration is a keen interest. And my next panelist, Hattie McFadden, is a senior sustainability specialist at Promar, working with businesses across the supply chain, including the cereals, dairy and red meat sectors. Hattie supports farmers and growers to develop and transition their roadmaps to net zero. And Hattie has real-life international experience of supporting projects seeking to implement adaptive practices in agriculture and climate change. My third panellist is Zara Dorrington. Zara graduated from the University of Reading with a degree in agriculture, whereupon she worked as an assistant farm manager at the Royal Farm, Windsor. Zara's returned to the family farm 4 years ago and is now managing the farm, adapting mixed farming management practices with a very keen focus on efficiency and sustainability across the board. And last but not least, Lee Reeves joins us. He's the head of agriculture for Lloyds Bank and the Bank of Scotland, appointed in March 2020, and has responsibility for over 36,000 farming customers and £4 billion of lending. Lee has a passion for supporting the farming and rural community and understands the complexities of the food supply chain from field to fork. Lee leads a team of agricultural specialists who are available to share their sector-specific knowledge and ultimately to work and support his customers and the wider customers manage profitable and resilient businesses. So Lee, can I hand over to you at that point and ask you just to expand on the partnership between Promar and Lloyds, and perhaps also to share what support Lloyds is able to offer?
And thanks so much, Anna, and great to be on, and thank you for joining us. So I look after 65 relationship managers who work right across the UK with SME-sized businesses, some of our larger farms, dealing with things like farm purchases, land purchases, on-farm investments and development projects, diversification initiatives, asset finance and working capital. Obviously, one of the things that people are really talking about at the moment is the cost of living crisis, and how we the impacts on input prices, margins and profitability, all that kind of stuff. So they're there day to day working with their clients and really passionate about farm, which is absolutely what I love. In terms of them themselves, they're trusted advisors. They really work with their clients day in, day out to kind of work through all of the challenges. But we're not here just to talk about the kind of here and now. We want to talk about the medium and the long-term strategies as well. And with that, being profitable and more productive and efficient. And obviously, one of the reasons that we kind of came to you a couple of years ago in terms of forming a partnership was really to start thinking about the transition to net zero. So, the NFU came out with their goal of transitioning to net zero by 2040 about the same time. And we thought it was really important that, we started to help clients on that journey. So the thought leadership that we produced a couple of years ago was really well received by our clients, and our relationship managers, had some fantastic conversations with their clients. But of course, we're a couple of years further down the line now. And one of the things I'm really thoughtful about is that, there's some new thinking, fresh thinking that's out there. And obviously we've been able to learn some lessons around what are the things that are really working and, farmers are doing to help that transition. So re-engaging with you on this piece of work now has been really thought-provoking and helpful, and hopefully the subsector fact sheets that we will talk about a little bit later will really help our clients and everybody else across around that transition to net zero. So really pleased with the partnership, and really delighted that we're able to share it today.
That's great. Thank you very much, Lee. And I'm going to hand over to Luke now, who's going to talk about the current landscape influencing net zero. Luke, over to you.
Thank you for that, Anna. And thanks for having me on today. As Lee just mentioned, great to revisit the work we started with Lloyds a couple of years ago, and particularly given the changes that we've seen in that time and some of the unprecedented challenges that the sector has faced since. As Lee's just described, you can't really talk about the future of agriculture without adding net zero to the conversation. I also think we have to place this in the context of current issues that are going on when we're talking about net zero. There's a challenging landscape at the moment, and that's unfolded over recent years. We've experienced a perfect storm of recovery from COVID-19, shortage of workers in some sectors, and this has been compounded by some of the impacts of the war in Ukraine upon the cost and availability of feed, fuel, fertilizer, all while trying to plan for future activity following agricultural transition. So against that, it is quite understandable that net zero might feel overwhelming or might have dropped on the list of priorities. But despite this, it's really important that we're not losing sight of progressing along that pathway to net zero. There's good reason for the feeling of urgency around this, despite maybe some of the pressures that you're feeling from its omnipresence in conversations that you might be having. Net zero goals were agreed on an international stage in 2015 in recognition of some of the catastrophic effects of global temperature rises. The Paris Agreement, signed by the UK at COP21, set some science-based targets to limit this rise in temperature to ideally 1.5 degrees, but a maximum of 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. So net zero is seen as a central strategy to limit this warming. So what is net zero, and what does that mean for the agricultural industry? Achieving net zero for the UK means that the UK's 45 million tonnes of agricultural greenhouse gas emissions made up of methane, nitrous oxide, and carbon dioxide need to be reduced and then balanced with the carbon taken down from the atmosphere that is then sequestered into healthy soils, trees, and hedgerows. So the UK has enshrined net zero targets into law, with a target of 2050 in England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. Scotland's a little more ambitious with a target of 2045. And as Lee mentioned earlier, the NFU have a target themselves of 2040. There's retailers that have followed suit as well, most notably Morrison's, who target to be directly supplied by net zero carbon farms by 2030. So this is recognizing their responsibility within the supply chain while seeing the value of sustainability credentials to their consumers. So the implications of all this for farmers and landowners are really wide-reaching and will fundamentally change the way in which we farm, and we're already seeing that now. Without agriculture playing a major role, the UK won't reach net zero. So farmers and land managers occupy a really unique position and will be key drivers of the UK's net zero ambitions going forwards. That's because they've got responsibility of both emission sources as well as carbon sinks in the 70% of land that's occupied by agriculture in the UK. This should be seen as a huge opportunity for the sector. And that really is reflected in the government strategy, with net zero placed at the heart of agricultural policy for the coming decades. Payments after and during agricultural transition will be based on public goods such as soil health and biodiversity, which themselves link into net zero. And some predictions based upon ELMS itself. In England, it's projected to decarbonise agricultural emissions by 6 million tonnes a year from 2033 and beyond. So really significant numbers there. So on top of the subsidies, there'll be some access to further financial benefit from supply chain initiatives, perhaps extra money on your milk price if you're a dairy farmer, potential partnerships for biodiversity net gain with planners, and also really young emerging carbon credit markets as well, which we'll cover later. Access to these funds, these sources of finances, will come to those who can demonstrate they can protect and build carbon on our farmland, as well as limiting them emissions too. So there's clearly a huge challenge ahead in tackling that 45 million tonnes of greenhouse gas emissions. A recent report from the Climate Change Committee highlighted some of the lack of progress towards decarbonising the UK agricultural sector, but hopefully this is going to act to catalyse and accelerate some change within the sector. The industry's got the opportunity to ramp up net zero efforts in the coming years as greater incentivisation emerges and farms begin to better understand and measure the benefits of their actions to both improve productivity and profitability for the farm business, as well as to the environment as well. So, as I mentioned, huge opportunities for farmers and landowners, but only if they're supported to identify and implement these wide range of sustainability measures. So a good step to start with, and really important going forward, is to make sure you've got a good understanding of the baselines of your farm emissions, sequestration and biodiversity. And from that, you'll be able to reap maximum benefit from these measures that are available. So 4 key areas you can begin looking at when looking at practical steps includes improved productive efficiency. So this is increasing the rate at which inputs are converted into outputs. So perhaps seeing how investment in suitable infrastructure can retain productivity and also have the co-benefit of meeting new regulations that are coming in, etc. Land management. So again, how you can increase the productivity of your system whilst also looking to tie in and enhance carbon sequestration. So a big focus on regenerative practices, which is another big area that we can cover, Things like reduced tillage, mob grazing, agroforestry all have good potential. Next up, a really important one, given the backdrop of what we've discussed and potential issues with energy security going forwards, is looking at resource and energy use efficiency. So things like optimizing organic manure usage, if you've got livestock, which will potentially bring down your fertilizer costs. If you've not, just looking at optimizing synthetic fertilizer applications as well. And then finally, something that ties all this together and will drive us forwards to net zero in hopefully a quicker trajectory of the next decades is looking at innovation. Are there areas of land you can set aside to trial new innovative measures on? Can you keep an open mind for new and emerging technologies such as genetic advancements, things like feed additives, which include opportunities to be using seaweed, for instance, which has great potential to reduce methane. Hattie's going to get into a couple more of these practical examples shortly, so I will leave her to crack on with that very shortly.
Thanks very much, Luke. That's really helpful overview. And an interesting question from Cameron Hughes, one of our listeners, asking, is it possible for the industry as a whole to transition to net zero? And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Yes, I hope so. I think it's very challenging as things stand. There are select farmers that we're working with and good examples across various subsectors of agriculture that are almost there. They have had big levels of investment and research focused on them to reach that stage. But I think with some of the innovation that's going to come through that is perhaps currently unknown, that will definitely drive things forwards. I think we need good leadership. Good to see that Rishi Sunak has finally agreed to go to COP27 in the coming weeks. So despite the sentiment of that, it's good that we have that figure going there and showing that we're serious about it. I think it's heavily reliant on buy-in from farmers across the board, but that buy-in can only be achieved if there's incentivization there to bring in that level of innovation as well. So yeah, in short, I think it is possible, but there does need to be investment, buy-in, and innovation across the board.
Thanks very much, Luke. That's really insightful. And yes, we'll pass on to Hattie now, who's going to talk about what net zero means at a farm level and how you might be able to make some changes directly on your farm. So over to you, Hattie.
Thanks so much, Anna. Thanks, Luke, for that as well. So yeah, Luke's kind of talking about net zero as a landscape, whereas I kind of want to touch on a farm level. So tomorrow, what can be done type of thing, and there should be a slide that pops up as well with some of these key factors on it. I want to start with a question that basically says, where do I start and why should I? And I think the why should I aspect is quite important and should be kind of highlighted in discussions like this. We've got a certain level of buy-in from talking about the climate crisis and the part that we can play where we can, and even buy into kind of improving resilience on farm if you're affected by the climate crisis in the future, which is great. But one really important aspect that I just want to highlight is here's in response to the why should I, is just how closely linked your carbon efficiency is to your efficiency on farm. And improvements made in your carbon footprint, if they come out the other end on your report every year, are likely to be due to improvements in overall efficiency that you've made on your farm. It's a win-win case in many of these things in terms of when we talk about net zero and when we talk about efficiency in general. So that's kind of I've tried to kind of answer that why should I from a different perspective. But for the where do I start, I don't think it's going to be a surprise to anyone that I've got carbon footprinting as the first point here. It gets talked about, spoken about a lot in the industry at the moment, and increasingly so in different sectors. Those in the dairy sector and those that, you know, retailers ask them to complete it, they're already on that pathway. Those that do it for out of their own interest, and then there's another group of people who haven't done one before. So think about doing that carbon footprint is a really good indicator of efficiency on farm. I think, yes, everything is in terms of carbon equivalent, CO2 equivalent, which makes it feel one step removed from your practices on farm. But once you really get into where this carbon equivalents are coming from, the key performance indicators that come out of that carbon footprint, you're going to start to see that closer relationship between efficiency and your carbon footprinting. Key performance indicators such as mortality, for instance, or fertilizer use per hectare. A lot of these carbon tools have those KPIs at the end of it. In terms of which tool, there are many kind of resources out there which compare the tools and that kind of thing, which is great. So let's say you've done your carbon footprint, but you're waiting. Maybe you want a little bit more assistance with that, or something else. So you want to practice where, without carbon footprinting, you can start to think about your net zero pathway. I think one good method is to basically create a mind map of your main operations. Basically, what do I buy in? How do I use this? And what do I produce from what I buy in? And when you start to map this, when you're reading the fact sheets that Lee might talk about later, reading all of, you know, CL's got a net zero report and that kind of thing, you can start to map what options are relevant to your farm, to what's inherent in your farm's practices and operations, which is really great. And it leads on to the third question of, what am I struggling with? What are my main issues? Again, to circle back to this, why should I? Improving on those main issues that you're struggling with on farm is likely to improve your carbon footprint and kind of enable you to get further down that net zero pathway. If I can provide some examples, soil health with drought resilience, we've all kind of experienced a bit of a drought this year. Energy prices, livestock fertility, all of these operations, when they have room for improvement, will benefit your carbon footprint as well and help you on this net zero journey, which is really important. So that was the where do I start and kind of why should I. Talking about your main options that are out there, it's hard to do a little bit of a quick summary, which is why we're kind of going to plug some resources in that you can have a look at later. But I want to split it, talking about livestock versus arable and horticulture. So split those two out and talk about each. So livestock is fairly comparable when we're talking about options. Of course, there are different focuses for each livestock type, if we're talking about dairy, beef, sheep, pigs, or poultry. And the comparability among these livestock are due to the inherent nature again. So they all need to eat. We feed them. We want them to eat well in order for them to produce what we want them to produce. We want them to be healthy. They all excrete, and we need to work out how we manage that and utilize that effectively, because it's a product that we can use in our sector, which is great. And we need energy to house them and regulate their environment, more so in different management systems, especially with pigs and poultry and that kind of thing. Some also have bigger wins here on this option list, such as feed efficiency. Animal health is important, and then manure management if we talk about livestock. So switching quickly to arable horticulture, it's more about this nitrogen use, this fertilizer use. A bigger percentage of emissions from arable is from fertilizer, of course. We're talking about crop rotations and integrations and energy usage. Luke also kind of mentioned this innovation aspect as well. So do keep your eye on innovations, and that's our job really, to make it easier to understand what innovations are out there and what might hit and what might be accessible in the future. At the moment, whether that's feed additives, whether that's reducing barriers to precision agriculture technologies and everything in between really. So hopefully this was just a quick insight onto kind of why this is important, where to start, and set the scene for what options are out there, which after you do the first kind of carbon footprinting and mapping operations, you can see what is more applicable really to your system.
Thanks very much, Hattie. I was just wondering, are there any activities which result in a bigger impact than others?
Yeah, of course. Thinking about, if we take livestock, for example, let's take the example of dairy. A lot of emissions come from enteric fermentation, which is the methane that your dairy cow produces. And if you feed the right level of protein, you can try and reduce that level of methane that your cow is producing in comparison to energy use, which might make up 1 or 2% of your carbon footprint for your dairy cow. So you can see bigger wins here in feed, and on the arable side, it's down to your fertilizer and your yields as well.
Okay, thanks for that. And scale is obviously a big issue. Is it easier for certain sized farms or enterprises to reach net zero? Is it easier for larger or more complex farms to reach net zero?
Good question. Very good question. I definitely wouldn't exclude smaller farms from being able to reach that net zero. And I think that's because when we talk about net zero, we talk about total emissions versus total carbon sequestration. So whilst a smaller farm can be as or more efficient or less efficient than a larger farm, there's not really scope there. There's some economies of scale, but there's many examples of smaller farms being more efficient, and I'm talking more efficient carbon equivalent units per output. So if you produce 1 kilogram of carcass weight and you compare the two, then they can be more efficient. But if we're talking about total emissions, I think it's a process and it's a pathway. So there are investments that you can make to see that positive change in your transition. Thankfully, there's a range of investments. So if a larger farm has less barriers to capital investments than a smaller farm, they can make different investments into that net zero pathway than smaller farms. So I wouldn't necessarily exclude small farms from this conversation at all.
Okay, that's, I'm sure, reassuring to many. A question from the audience, from Alan Garrett. Will going to zero carbon reduce small farms' profit? And is it inevitable that those farms that get bigger will survive? And I think you've touched on this already, Hattie, but
yeah.
Any thoughts on that first point?
No, it's all about efficiency. Every farm's going to be different on this pathway. Some farms are going to be able to reduce their emissions a lot quicker and easier than other farms, and that's the nature of it. And that's also, it's good to celebrate the fact that there are so many options here, because there will be a plethora of options which suit each farm, which is great. About reducing small farms' profit, there are some options which are cost incurring and some options which are cost saving. And the cost saving options is more about improving that efficiency. So really, if you improve that efficiency, you shouldn't be reducing your profit at all. So yeah, I'd say I think it's understandable where that question has come from, and especially the inevitability of only getting bigger. But I think that's a larger conversation around small family-run farms in the UK. There's a few articles out recently about, more needs to be done to encourage access to labour, diversification, and policies to kind of help smaller farmers. The net zero pathway shouldn't, in my opinion, be a reason to particularly exclude small farms and contribute to that narrative, I think.
That's fantastic. Thanks very much, Hattie. And I'm sure Zara will echo those thoughts. Zara, if I can introduce you at this point and ask you if you can tell us a bit more about how you got involved with Lloyds and the Clean Growth Initiative.
Yeah, hello. Thank you very much for having me on. So I manage the family farm now in Lincolnshire, and we're a mixed farm. So we do dairy, arable, and even include potatoes on that arable side of things. From a sort of directive point of view on the farm, we've always been looking at how we can be as efficient as possible and robust. And that is our view on sustainable and how we can be going forward to future-proof the business and make it last. So over the last few years, well, last decade or so anyway, we've been doing things such as genetic testing, growing as much home produce for the cattle as we can on the farm and trying to return farmyard manures back onto the land. Had some solar panels and a few small things that we were doing to improve our efficiency. And without realizing it initially at the start, actually by improving our efficiency, we were helping head towards reducing our carbon footprint. And then over the more recent years, we've been looking to add and change a few more further things in, and we were needing to put a new building on for the dairy side of the business. And we decided that if we were going to build a building, we should do one that hopefully help with our sustainable and carbon footprint going forward. So we were able to approach Lloyds and discuss the previous steps we'd already made, trying to breed as much good genetics into the cows, utilize our feed efficiencies and those side of things, and designing the shed that we were going to put up to be as carbon efficient as possible. So hopefully you can all see on your screens, we've just put up a couple of pictures of the shed as it was going up. It was very exciting. And the main feature that was initially visible was the pitch of the roof. So we wanted this extra pitch of the roof to help draw it through, and that's reduced our need for fans within the shed. The shed also has slurry channels within it to get that slurry and the methane below ground as soon as possible. And other features within it, such as the light ridge down the middle, has reduced our need for electricity in there further. The slurry channels all run on weirs, so there's no electrical pumps or any sort of features like that. The shed itself then also has big wide passageways, which were enabling us to be able to put an electric robot in there and overall improve cow health and welfare. And healthier cows produce more milk. Hopefully you can see some more pictures there. Produce more milk better. We've had great reduction in mastitis cases since going into there, which has reduced our antibiotic usage on farm and a few other features. So we've been really delighted with that, but we wouldn't have been able to do it initially without the investment from Lloyds. So by being more efficient, we could be more sustainable, and that was able to drive our profits. To then be able to invest back in. But in order to make a big jump into the next step of being efficient, that was where we were really able to work in this good partnership with Lloyds, and we were delighted to do that. We are a wider business as a whole, and we also had the arable side. So we were looking for ways to utilize that side of the aspect too and combine the new shed in. So we put in systems such as the slurry separator, and that has allowed us to cart the separated solids further away. And for this year, for example, we grew our entire maize crop purely from the solid manure extracted from that with no artificial fertilizers. So that helped to improve our fertilizer use. And we've also then been able to look at other options, such as putting in further silage plants, reducing the need for plastic and bale wrapping, which has reduced our diesel usage. You may be able to see in one of the bottom pictures as well, we started to attempt mob grazing. But the main thing with farming is the weather changes the whole time. Every field types are different, every soil types. So we haven't been able to pick certain things, and they've worked really well. We tried some stuff, and some years the weather's come and bitten us backwards. As you can see, probably from the grazing picture, we then dried up like the desert. So as much as you like for your mob grazing to think you're trying really good, we sometimes have to go back to the drawing board and trial again. But the main thoughts when we were looking to transition to net zero was, well, transition towards net zero is that it's net zero. So initially panicked that, my gosh, we've got to suddenly cut all our emissions. But no, we just need to look for ways that we can improve reducing it with some easy small steps. And then hopefully where else can we look to sequester more carbon on farm to get us to net zero. And really we've been able to, just from what we were doing anyway, we looked at our desire for efficiency, covered feed efficiency, covered protein efficiency, and then by wanting healthier, stronger cows, that's improved our animal robustness. And by being able to take the take the slurry that the cows produce and use it efficiently instead of seeing it as a waste product, we've been able to reduce our fertilizer use. So it's given us a really good base for starting off and seeing where we wanted to go. But we have loads of ideas bouncing through our heads the whole time. Some of them work immediately, some of them don't. And it's about, for me, not being too scared to try them, speaking to people who know and seeing how we can go with them and getting them there. Putting in a whole load of weirs to try and move your slurry versus using pumps was quite terrifying to start with. And we all watched, waiting to see if it would block up, but it didn't. So that's good. But it's not been as daunting as it has been. And for us, the main drive is that actually we're looking to be efficient and we're looking to be robust. And by doing that, we've naturally been able to bring our carbon footprint down, and it's been very rewarding so far.
Thanks for that insight. That's a fantastic story to hear. I'm just wondering what your experience was with the process in terms of the growth fund. Was it something that happened overnight, or does it take a little time? Do you have to be flexible? Zara, can you just expand on that a little bit?
Absolutely. So it took a bit of time. We were able to go to Lloyds and show our initial bits and practices that we've been doing with the cows already, and start to run through the figures as to what we wanted. And we did have to really sit down and go through all the figures to prove that it's worthwhile for ourselves as well as for Lloyds. But they were so supportive the whole way through, and very good ag manager. And once we were able to beat out the finer details and bits and pieces, it wasn't tricky as such. They were very kind to help out, and but it was more just that we were already on that journey, and by emphasizing, reiterating what we were doing already, it's amazing to reinforce with yourself that a lot of what you're doing is actually improving your efficiencies.
Great, thanks very much. And thanks to all of my panelists this afternoon for sharing those insights. And I just wonder if I could take this opportunity for you to share a take-home message. So if you were encouraging a farmer or a land manager, a listener, to take sort of one positive change, can I ask you all to have a think about what that change would be? Perhaps if we start with you, Lee, what one take-home message would you offer?
Well, for me, I think it would be probably going back to Hattie's opening, which is, where do I start? And for me, I think it would be around creating that baseline. So, choosing a carbon calculator, whichever one you want to use, just get a baseline and understand what it tells you, and then think about the areas that you really want to, focus on over the next kind of 6-12 months, and then go from there. But getting the baseline really gets you started.
Great, thanks, Lee. Luke, what would your one take-home message be?
Yeah, understand it's all kind of been a little bit generalised today. We've touched upon some more specific things, but on the Lloyds site, there's going to be a link put up shortly. But access the 7 subsector fact sheets, whichever ones are specific to you. There's loads of in-depth points on there. You'd be able to go and have a look, see what you're doing already, seeing some things that you might not be doing, and having a look at innovation and what's coming up next in your particular sector. So that'd be a good place to start.
Great, thanks, Luke. And Hattie, your take-home message?
Yeah, I mean, as well as what Lee and Lucas said, I'd say have a conversation. Have a conversation with your agronomist, have a conversation with your nutritionist. If you're a livestock farmer, have a conversation with your vet, work out a health plan. So it's those conversations to start and start applying what you're reading to your farm itself.
Thanks, Hattie. Don't be overwhelmed. I get that message. And Zara, can I come to you finally? What would your take-home message be? Have a go, or?
Yeah, absolutely. Also stems back from benchmarking. If you can find yourself a base and you know where you're at, although it seems a big start, actually it makes it much easier to then see the little improvements and see that they're working and that they pay off. But yeah, don't be afraid to try.
Great, thank you all. And Lee, just to come back to you, where should listeners go to seek further advice and guidance and support and access to those fact sheets?
Yeah, so, well, firstly, can I just reiterate your comments, just to say a huge thank you to the presenters. So you for chairing, Anna, and also Zara, in terms of our customer coming on to talk about what she's been doing on the farms, but also Hattie and Luke in terms of their great run through. So really, really appreciate that. So yeah, where do you go? You go onto our website. So just click on the Sustainable Agriculture Hub on our website. We've got some fantastic stuff on there. Luke mentioned the subsector fact sheets, which are in the top right-hand corner of this slide. This is what they look like. They give some fantastic hints and tips in terms of what different sectors can do to help themselves on that transition. So please download those, and they're available to you. Also on there, though, is the stuff that I talked about earlier in terms of the stuff that we did back in June 2020 when we came out with our original thought leadership around transitioning to net zero. And as part of that, we put out a proposition which Zara's talked about a little bit, which has two key things that I want to talk about. One, which is the Clean Growth Finance Initiative. It's not a fund, it's an initiative because it's ongoing, which is basically fee-free lending for sustainable projects. So we can give you up to 1% discount on your arrangement fee when you kind of go with that sustainable project. So yeah, have a look at that. And then secondly, we can provide discounted trees and hedgerows through the Woodland Trust. So we've got a partnership with the Woodland Trust, which has been going now for a couple of years, and it's really, really good for our customers. So again, please click on there and get access to that. Failing that, if you still want access to information, then my information will be available on the slide, to my email address, or just give us a call and we will talk you through. But the website is probably the best place to go.
Thanks very much, Lee. Very helpful. And now we have a little bit of time where we can take some of your questions. Some of them we've received in advance, but if you have got any questions for us, the panelists this afternoon, then please don't hesitate to drop those into the comment box below. I think we'll kick off with one of the questions here from Matthew McIntosh. And it's around emissions and the beef and dairy sector. So the question is beef and dairy production one of the largest agricultural carbon sources? And would reducing numbers of head in British consumption be a way forward? Are there any alternatives for the industry? So I'm just wondering if perhaps Luke or Hattie might want to address that question.
Yeah, I'll jump in there. Big question indeed. So, is beef and dairy production one of the largest agricultural carbon sources? I'm gonna switch that carbon to greenhouse gas, because we know that a lot of methane comes off our herds, and say yes, it's a quite an important sector to be looking at in the agricultural greenhouse gases that come off agriculture, which is why there's been a lot of focus on dairy already, driven through retailers as well, which is good. Would reducing the number of our dairy herds and British consumption be the way forward? Of course, it would reduce overall total emissions if we kept on doing things efficiently. Do I think that's the best way forward for our sector? Not particularly. There's a good, for those interested more on this topic, Sustain recently held a conference, the role that beef and dairy play in the climate crisis, which really tackled this question, which was quite good. I think we're experiencing a bit of a decline in dairy. In the number, there's some people exiting the industry, so I definitely don't think it's the right thing to say, right, everyone reduce your herds in half. It wouldn't be best for the sector. But what I will say is there's space for us to get more efficient. We're already globally quite efficient at our dairy and beef production, but there's space to get more efficient, which is great, which is a really good thing going forward. What's the alternative for the industry, which was also part of this question? I think there is a movement for public money for public goods, which opens up a lot of opportunities for our dairy and beef farmers, especially since they're more likely to have a lot of grazing land, which I think should be lent into where it can. Really lean into what can I do for my land? Can I get anything for the good services that I'm providing here with my pasture land? Don't forget that pasture soil health is quite good. So yeah, complex question, but that's my answer really.
Thanks very much, Hattie. Does anyone else want to add anything to that, or I'm happy to move on?
Yeah, if you don't mind, I'll hop in. Understand sort of the concerns of people potentially listening to that question and discussing dropping the numbers in herds. Just touching on something that Hattie mentioned there, in terms of efficiencies, genetic improvements are going to be really significant for beef and dairy herds over the next couple of decades. So there's a potential of maintaining efficiency across the herd whilst also reducing the number of animals within that herd, because you've got each animal producing either more meat or more dairy. So yeah, I think there's big opportunities there. Also, yeah, completely understand there are losses across the country, potential issues with regulations coming in, and worries around livestock density as well. So hopefully some of them advancements in genetics can help sort of abate some of them issues.
Thanks, Lee, for your input there. Question here, perhaps for Lee, from one of our listeners, Britta Weber. I'd like to learn more about how Lloyds Bank Agricultural sees carbon credits as a means to transition to net zero. Lee, do you think you could comment on that one?
Yeah, I'll certainly give a personal view. It's probably not a house view, which is, there's definitely a part that carbon credits is going to play in the transition. I think everybody agrees that that's the case. But I guess as a banker, I'd probably look more at the risks than perhaps other people, and alongside the opportunities. And I think for me, the risks are still not really clear and transparent to everybody in terms of the kind of things that we really need to be thinking through. There is some obviously regulation out there in terms of voluntary carbon markets, but for me probably needs still more of a framework around it that we can either all kind of coalesce around. And so for me, I think we just need to be really thoughtful about the timing of farmers going into using carbon credits, etc., and not going in too early. So just making sure that they understand where they are in terms of their own emissions. Obviously you have to be at net zero already to start to think about carbon credits, and trading carbon, etc. So it's just I think about timing. It's about making sure that we're doing it when we really understand the risks, and also the upsides in terms of where the carbon markets are going in terms of future value and all that kind of stuff. So I wouldn't rush into it, I guess, is what I would say. But there's definitely a part it is going to play as things evolve over the next couple of years, and the market will definitely evolve, and as I say, become more transparent.
Great, thanks, Lee. And a question from one of the audience about investment and levels of investment. And perhaps this is maybe one for Zara. What level of investment is needed to see positive change in the transition to net zero? Zara, you've obviously had some investment, and you've talked about lots of different innovation and changes that you've made on your family farm. What's your view on what level of investment is needed to see a benefit, to see a positive change?
Well, I'd say in terms of level, it can be very small initially, and you don't necessarily need to have investment started off. But it's a big scale as to how far you'd like to go. So small things such as we were able to move away from soya very early on. That didn't require any actual investment. It cost us nothing monetary to move from soya to rape meal. And that's looking at the market. So level of investment there is small, and then building up to actually, in order to become more efficient, you can with buildings and sheds on farms, you hit a dead wall eventually. We were knocking out walls, and there's only so much we could do to make our shed have better airflow and not be needing fans and load of extra lights. And that was where, at the other end of the spectrum, we decided we needed a new shed, and that was a much larger scale of investment. So it's sliding, and it depends what you would like to start with. Start small, and you could go much bigger.
Great, thank you very much. And just as an aside, what's brought you greatest satisfaction in your journey to net zero?
Well, farming in general, all things you have to enjoy it, and whatever you put in with passion. Like I said at the start, I really enjoy how, if I can do something successfully, it makes the farm more sustainable going forward. I do it more efficiently, and it works really well, and it's a success, and it's not gone absolutely Pete Tong. And I've got everyone saying, "Why the hell did you try and do that?" We've now got to clear up the mess. Anything that's been successful, and obviously, is much better. But the best thing is like healthier, happier cows. Amazing. They produce better milk. We're making a really good food product that we can be proud of to sell. And it's not necessarily the biggest yields from the highest inputs. It's really efficient, and it's having really healthy, happy livestock, and hopefully a good bubble altogether. But lots of different parts to do with farming.
That's great. Thanks, Zara. A question here from Richard Gardner on a slightly different tangent regarding tenancies. And the question is, do you see short-term tenancies, and by that we mean sort of 1 to 5 years, as being a barrier to sustainable practices being adopted? Luke, Hattie, I don't know if you'd like to tackle that one.
I think it matches what Zara's saying as well. There are some shorter term gains that can be made in terms of switching your feed, focusing on animal health, for instance, that, or I keep talking about livestock, but on the arable side as well, your nutrient management plans and the like of that. I think that's the difficulty, is when you have to take long-term investments that have a larger payback period that might, extend over the contract of your tenancies. So I think, again, it comes back to making sure that what you want to focus on is right for your current situation. And for a shorter-term tenancy, then focusing on those quick wins often that you can implement within the next coming months.
Great, thanks, Hattie. Another question here that's just come in from Stuart Manning. How significant do the presenters believe that energy from farm waste will be towards net zero? Luke, would you be able to tackle that one?
I'll have that one, yeah. So I take it that sort of linking into the whole AD discussion, which has been sort of growing and quite prevalent at the centre of how we might achieve net zero. I think AD has some good potential, and is a good example of a circular economy. The waste gets chucked in, you're limiting emissions from storage, and you're producing biogas and a digestate as an output, which are both good, and good products to use on the farm. There are some issues around what the feedstock going into the AD plant is, maize being a major one of them, which isn't necessarily a farm waste product. Issues around maize includes issues with like soil around harvesting time, etc. There's also the potential conversation around food security there, and whether growing maize to chuck into an AD plant is causing a bit of an issue, given the fact that we're trying to produce more as a nation as well. I think there's a Bangor University research paper out there that pits the two against each other, and I think it gives AD a potential of 8% in terms of our progression towards net zero, whereas a strategy which focuses on more reduction of that waste initially, and potentially investing in solar and planting food for human consumption instead could save up to 15%. So that's just one paper that I've come across myself, but it might not be the savior that it's pitched as previously.
Okay, thanks for that, Luke. And we've probably got time for just one more. So question to Lee. I wonder if you've noticed there to be any trends in variation of uptake for support and guidance. Have you noted any trends at all, Lee?
So, in terms of guidance for anything in particular, sorry, and what's the question aimed at? Can you tell me?
So the question was, have you noted there to be any trends in variation for uptake of support and guidance, and in terms of accessing that guidance, how can we've provided the links, but is it something that, I guess the best advice is just to pick up the phone, is it? But is there any variation in terms of, geographic spread or demographics, for example?
No, I don't think there is any. No, I don't think there is in terms of geographic spread, really. I think people are interested in this stuff. I think there is some volatility in the political markets at the moment, isn't there, in terms of just how much emphasis is going to be put on net zero and food production going forwards, etc. But I think everybody's still of the view that sustainability, net zero is going to be really key for everybody going forwards. And so our view has been that we're having conversations with all of our customers. All of our customers do seem to be interested in the topic, and as I say, we're not seeing any kind of trends geographically that suggest that one part of the country is impacted differently to another. So I guess the answer is no. The best thing to do is just to engage with your relationship manager or your consultant or your agronomist. Just have the conversations and start to move things forward.
Great, thanks, Lee. And that's probably about all we've got time for this afternoon. So if there are any questions that we've not been able to answer, we will do those offline. And if I could just take this opportunity to thank my panelists today. Thank you, Lee, Luke, Hattie and Zara for your time. As I said earlier, the slides and the resource pack and a recording of the webinar will be available. There will be an email letting you know when that is available. And just a final thank you really to our listeners. We hope that you've enjoyed the webinar this afternoon and it's provided some food for thought and given you some advice as to where to go to look and take these steps forward. So thank you once again and good night.